During the first official Juneteenth celebrations in Texas in 1866, Black Americans ceremoniously cast off their ragged clothes and threw them into the rivers and creeks. They then dressed in clothing taken from their former masters as a symbol of their newfound freedom. For freed slaves, having control over their attire was an expression of freedom and a way to cast off their identity as slaves. But we ask ourselves, what was the identity of the freed slaves prior to slavery? To answer that question, we need to look back at the history of African slave trading. The majority of slaves came from the West Central African region that included 11 countries. The most destructive time of the transatlantic slave trade lasted from 1675 to 1808. During this time, roughly 2/3 of the 12 million slaves were shipped out of Africa to America. Most of the enslaved Africans were either captured in battle, kidnapped, or sold into slavery as punishment or to repay a debt. Prior to a life of slavery, what did Africans wear in their native land? Traditional African costumes were woven or printed fabric, wrapped or draped around the body. This forms the nucleus of tribal clothing. This was followed with embellishments and accessories made from beads, feathers, gold, silver, seashells, ivory, fur, skins, and other items. The skin of an animal was often chosen for symbolic significance, indicating tribal allegiance or personal totems that would bring good health and luck to the wearer. Colors and patterns created in printed and dyed cloth, woven fabric strips, or beaded attire distinguish one ethnic group from another. Tribes would pride themselves on the quality of their handmade cloth using techniques that have been handed down generation by generation for centuries. These clothes can be used as wraps and capes or sewn into garments for both men and women. Up until the 19th century, slave codes dictated what enslaved people could or couldn't wear. Under the code in some states, like Virginia and South Carolina, slave owners were legally required to provide clothing to enslaved workers. The clothing they did provide, however, was often uncomfortable, emphasizing durability over comfort or style. Some slave owners gave their workers fabric instead of clothes, expecting them to cut and sew their own clothing. These fabrics included flannel, Osnaburg linen, and plains, a stout and heavy woolen cloth that was often hot and scratchy to wear. Fabric such as Osnaburg, jean, and kersey were considered suitable for the lower ranks of society. In 1861, during the Civil War, newly emancipated slaves spent hours waiting in line to pick the clothing of their choice from boxes of old and new clothing that were distributed from the northern states. The clothes that were given away were often soiled and old, but the newly freed Americans were eager to discard their coarse, plain weave fabrics and thick linen clothes that had been the badge of slavery. They were able to choose whatever clothing they were given to remove the physical mark of their former status.